Hi there and welcome to another video. In this video I'll be following on from my recent overview of the latest Maya 2023 release, and I'll be focusing on one of the new features that I highlighted, the introduction of Bifrost-USD. This won't be a lengthy tutorial into the whole workflow. Instead, in this first video I'll be starting with a basic overview of the fundamentals of Bifrost-USD and how this new integration fits into the whole Maya and USD workflow. So with the latest Maya 2023 release, Autodesk also updated their USD for Maya and Bifrost for Maya plugins, and both these plugins had several really cool updates. But for me, the most significant was the integration of Bifrost and USD, as it essentially combines the power of USD in assembling, organizing and editing assets non-destructively with the flexibility and power of Bifrost and the Bifrost graph. So with this new integration, how does it all fit together? I want to use this video to start exploring the basic concepts and fundamentals, as it's important to understand the context of each one when it comes to USD working in Maya. So first we'll start with USD itself. So USD stands for Universal Scene Description, and it's a software framework originally created by Pixar for the interchange of 3D data. And it also allows for a far more efficient way for managing data and collaboration in a pipeline. Now, I won't be explaining the details of USD itself in this video. There's a lot of material out there, but I'll include some links in the description below for you to explore. So next there's USD for Maya. This allows Maya to communicate with USD. It allows it to view, load and interact and edit USD data in Maya. This is made possible with a plugin, which we can see here in Maya's plugin manager, Maya USD plugin. Now the workflow associated with this plugin allows you to import USD data into Maya via two methods, but there's a distinct difference between each one of those methods. For example, the first one is a simple file import. So if we go to the file menu and choose import, this allows us to choose a .usd file just as we would choose, say, an OBJ file or an FBX file, and when we choose it we will load in a particular USD file. So we can see here I've loaded in the Pixar kitchen set into Maya, and this method essentially converts the USD data into Maya data. So when it appears in our scene, if we look at the hierarchy, it looks like normal Maya nodes and geometry, and even when we look at the attribute editor, it basically looks like any other data that we usually would have created in Maya. But what we're working on isn't actually true USD data per se, it's actually Maya data. Maya has converted the USD data into Maya to allow you to work on it inside Maya. Now this is often referred to as a round trip workflow, in that you import USD data, edit and work on it as if it's intrinsic Maya data, and then export it back out again to USD format. The other method of loading USD data into Maya is to load a stage. A stage is USD terminology for a scene or scene graph that contains multiple layers and structures of data. Now, loading USD stage into Maya is done via this option here in the Create menu. And we have two options. We can create an empty stage with a new layer, and I won't go into that right now, or we can simply load in a USD file as a stage. So if I choose this option here and choose the same kitchen set.usd, this will load that into Maya. But notice how much quicker it actually was. Now the reason for this is because Maya is not doing any conversion of the data. It's loading the USD data in its purest form. So what we're working on now and what we're seeing is actually native USD data. Now there's a number of benefits to this. For starters, if we look in the outliner, what Maya has done is it's created this Maya USD proxy node, and we can see when we expand out the hierarchy, the structure is exactly the same as what we saw a moment ago when we did a file import, except the color coding is different and some of the icons are also different. And the reason for that is because all the integrity and the relationships contained in this USD data have been maintained, and that means that we can make certain creative choices based on how this USD file has been set up. For example, if we take this refrigerator, this is zoom in a bit and we'll find it in the hierarchy. This is the node, and you'll notice the icon has got a curve and a V next to it. That means that this contains a variant set, and a variant set is the ability to have an alternate version in the scene which people can choose to use instead of the one that we see right now. So if I right mouse click this and just move down to this menu here, variant sets, modeling variant, and there's two. There's decorated, which is turned on, or bare. So if I switch this on to bare, we can see that there's a different version of the refrigerator. Now we might choose to use this for maybe a particular shot or sequence or whatever we're using USD data in, and then also we can maybe change it back to the decorated version. Also at the top level of the actual stage itself, if we look in the attribute editor looks very different to what we would normally see from a normal Maya node. We can see it's pointing to the .usd file that I loaded, but we can also change the display of it as well. Now, some USD files have almost essentially, you could say, an LOD version of the assets contained in the structure. So for example, it might have a proxy version, which we've got displayed here, which is, say, a low resolution version in terms of geometry and textures. And we can choose to literally swap this out for a higher resolution version for our final output. This kitchen set doesn't contain those versions, but some of the USD data that you can download for free does have different versions which you can choose between. Now, having this ability wouldn't be possible if I'd imported the data from Maya's file import option due to Maya's conversion of the data. Maya will import the structure of the data, but not the direct relationships that I just showed you. So none of the linking with the variants and also the proxy nodes or anything else, none of that is maintained. The file import process literally converts it into Maya data. Therefore, creating data as a stage or from a file can be better, because what you're seeing here and what you're working on in the outline is native USD data. And if this had been authored in something else that also supports and conforms to USD, and that could be anything really from Max to Houdini to Omniverse to Unreal Engine to Blender, anything that really supports and conforms the USD schema, that data integrity and relationships will also be imported by the stage method. Now, I've noticed that Autodesk often refer to this as USD for Maya, because we're loading USD data via the Maya UI, working on it alongside normal Maya data, or again, all via the Maya UI. So for the purposes of this video and others, I'll also refer to this as USD for Maya. For a more detailed explanation of this USD for Maya workflow, check out the video on my channel where I go through things in far more greater depth. And then finally, we have Bifrost-USD. So Bifrost-USD simply allows Bifrost to communicate with USD, but we load and manipulate USD data via Bifrost's graph editor and not Maya's main UI. So for the purposes of this and other videos, I will refer to this workflow as Bifrost-USD. Now, for this video, I want to start with the concept of stages in Bifrost-USD, and I'll be using the same Pixar kitchen set that I've already briefly shown. I'm using Maya 2023, Bifrost version 2.4.0, and for the Maya USD plugin, I'm using 0.17. The Maya 2023 shipped with 0.16 as default, and if you've got that version, then that's still perfectly fine. I'm just giving you more information as to why there might be some differences in my version as opposed to the one that you're actually using. Also, to support Bifrost-USD, Autodesk released a free lab pack of compounds and graphs that provide examples of the new functionality. It's free to download, and when installed, it will appear here in the Bifrost browser. There's two basic sections to look at. Examples is self-explanatory and has some examples of some of the basic USD workflows. The second section, glossary, is the Bifrost version of the Pixar USD glossary, and it shows how the two relate to one another. So for example, if I click on the variant set here and look at the info section, it simply says that this implements the variant set example from the Pixar USD glossary webpage. Nothing of what I'm about to show you in this video is dependent on this lab pack, but it's still a very useful thing to have, so I recommend you download it, and I'll include some links below for you to grab it. So for this tutorial, I've changed my Maya layout to this workspace I've created that helps me work with Bifrost-USD. Most of the screen real estate is taken up with the graph editor because that's where we need to spend most of our time. I also have another instance of Maya open here that has the kitchen set already loaded. And I used the USD for Maya workflow and created a stage from a file with this option here. Now what I want to do is recreate this but using Bifrost-USD. So the first thing I need to do is to create a graph. So let's do that. And then we need to add some nodes. But right now we don't really know what nodes to actually add. So a good starting point is from within the graph, hit the tab key and see what we have to work with. And if we move down the list of categories, you should now see a new USD section here. You'll also notice there's an additional section here called USD Lab. Now, you might not have this, and the reason why I've got it and maybe you haven't is because I've downloaded the free USD Lab pack from Autodesk, and it's added another category here. So don't worry about it if you don't have this particular pack. Now, looking through the USD section and the subcategories, if you're already familiar with USD and have been working with it, then you'll no doubt begin to recognize some of the names here and the terminology. But what we want to try and do is try and recreate that example of creating a stage from a file. So we're in the stage section and there's several nodes here that kind of appear to do the same thing, and I don't really know where to start. So what I did is I thought, well, I used the create menu in USD for Maya. So I'm going to choose this node here, create USD stage. So this brings in the node, and straight away we can begin to look at the info panel and look at the description and details of what this node is actually doing. We've got several inputs and we've got one output, and the output is basically a new stage. So this does actually create an entirely new stage inside Maya. Now when we plug this into Bifrost, so we want Bifrost to execute that instruction, what happens is that it adds a Maya USD proxy node into the outliner, and it adds a couple of entries into the USD layer editor. Now if we look at the node here first in the outliner, if we bring up our attribute editor, then we can see that everything kind of looks exactly as we would expect it to, and it's the same as what we see here in this instance where we've created it from a file. So we're on the same page, it looks like. Also, looking at the USD layer editor for just a moment, it added these two entries. The one I want to focus on is this one here, which has got .usd. Forget about this unshareable layer for now. That's a whole different concept, which I'm going to cover later on in the video. So just ignore that for now. So we have a stage. Now, the interesting thing to bear in mind here is that when I saw this stage, I thought, well, okay, I've got various ports here. But if I look at the parameters, it's creating a stage. So again, if I just click this icon here, I should be able to load kitchen set in, and it should all work. But when I did this, this option is performing a save function and not a load function. So that doesn't really work. And when I looked at the info panel, it's telling me that the input here is, this is the file path under which the stage will be saved. So that doesn't really kind of work. The other thing to bear in mind as well, and again, this is really important if you have an understanding of the concepts of USD, is that whenever you create a stage, every USD stage must have a root layer. Now the root layer is really important because it needs a root layer for any data in the stage to be saved. So right now we don't have a root layer as such. It's added an entry for it here in the USD layer editor, but there's no name. Now I can add that name here, which is what this info panel is telling us. It's telling us that this is the file path in which the stage will be saved. So very often the root layer name is the same as the stage. So if I just create a dummy path here and just put, say, /temp/test stage1.usd, hit enter, and you'll see that the name has changed here in the USD layer editor, and also we can see the path here. So we have an empty USD stage called teststage.usd, and the root layer for that stage is also called the same name as the file. Now this is okay, except this isn't really what I wanted. What I wanted to do is recreate this example here from the USD for Maya workflow, where I simply just created a stage, I pointed it to a file, it loaded the stage in, and here we can see the kitchen set, and it has a root layer called kitchen_set.usd. That's really what I want to do. I don't really want to create a separate sub layer. So I do have a stage here, So I guess what I can do is I can override the actual layer here with an input, but I don't know what node to plug into this layer port here. I don't know. So how can I find that out? Well, this is where Bifrost can actually help you. And it doesn't matter what you're doing in Bifrost, whether or not you're doing particle work, aero work, or geometry work, etc., etc. There's a good concept where if you right click on a port here, you'll get a section called Create Node. And Bifrost will suggest what nodes that you can plug into this particular port. And in this case, it's telling us that we only have one option, and that is the Open USD layer node. So if I select that, it brings in the node and it automatically connects it up. But notice what's happened when I've done this. This has now changed. This has now become empty.usd because we're overriding the instruction here. So if I unplug this, it goes back to our name that we specified. What I'm doing with this node is I'm saying, well, I don't want to use that name. I want to use the name from whatever file I'm going to load here. So if I plug this back in, let's look at our info panel, and it says this opens a USD file as a layer. So that's exactly what we want to do. We want to take that kitchen set USD file and load it in as a layer, which is going to be the root layer for our stage. So now if I just go to the node and the parameters, there's a section here, the file. So if I click this, select the kitchen set USD, and there we go, we've loaded in our data set. And note now in the USD layer editor, that empty.usd name temporarily has been replaced with kitchenset.usd, which is the root layer for this particular file. So it kind of works, we've got there, but it's not quite the same as what we had in the other instance of Maya, but we do have the same layer name and we do have the data set loaded. So we are kind of there. So at this point, if we just quickly review, we've taken a layer from a USD file and we've used that layer as the root node for this new stage that we've created. And then that stage has been executed by Bifrost. But notice that the read-only box is checked here on this open layer. So we're not saving anything out at the moment. So I now need to add extra nodes in to think about how to save things out. So that's where we can look at our stage option again, and we can look down the list and we've got Save USD Stage. So again, I can take the output from here, plug it into here, and then take the out stage and put it into the Bifrost output. So then all I do here is define a path and it should actually work. Now this all was going fine until I started to look further into the documentation provided by Autodesk, and they actually suggest a slightly different way of loading a stage with Bifrost-USD that isn't anything really like this. So let's take a look at that before we go any further. So let's start again with an empty scene and create a graph. Now, instead of using nodes like create or open a stage, it's suggested by Autodesk that we start with a node add to stage. So I'm going to bring up my menu, USD stage, and it's the first one on the list, add to stage. Now, if we take the output of this node and plug it into the output for Bifrost, you can see it actually creates the Maya USD proxy node in the outliner. And we essentially have a stage called Bifrost.USD, which we can also see here in the USD layer editor. So this node, although named add to stage, is also kind of creating a stage. And this is also what it explains here in the info panel. It says that this port here named stage is where you plug in an existing USD stage. But if nothing is connected, an empty stage is created. But what's interesting is that if we hover over the stage input and right click and choose create node, Bifrost is telling us what nodes that we can plug into this stage port. And it gives us the option to create a stage, open a stage from a layer, or just open a stage. So if I choose open, the node is automatically connected. And then from here under parameters, we can choose our kitchen set and then it loads. And if we look at the layer editor, we can see the layer here is the same name as the kitchen set that we just loaded. And this is exactly the same as if we loaded it in the UI with the USD for Maya workflow here. So using the open stage node here connected to the add to stage node, I think has a lot more in common with the USD for Maya workflow. And I think the reason this add to stage node is so important is because when working in Bifrost USD, you're probably always going to need this add to stage node, be it with an empty stage or starting with a file like I've got here, because you need this node to add anything to the stage, any definition here. And we can see in the info panel about what the type of definitions that you can add. And if we right click here and look at the create node suggestions, we can see all the types of USD schema that we can add into this particular stage. So in many ways, it makes a lot more sense to start with this add to stage node before we do anything else. And that's kind of how I read it anyway. Now, you may have noticed, and also something that I mentioned as well, that in exploring these simple workflows, in the USD layer editor, this unshareable layer has appeared above what we would normally expect to be the stage's main root layer. And our root layer is grayed out. Now, if we look at the other Maya instance, where we've used USD for Maya to load the stage, this layer isn't there at all. So what is it and why do we need to be aware of it? Well, this is where things can get a little bit complicated, but I'll try my best to explain it as simply as I can. Now, the first and main thing to remember is that in USD, anything you do with the data has to be stored on a layer. And this is an important principle to always bear in mind when working with USD data. Secondly, with the addition of Bifrost USD, you can now use and edit USD data in Maya in two contexts. You can use USD for Maya, as in via the main UI, but you can also use Bifrost USD. And you must be careful about this and how you want to work with your USD data. You can use these contexts independently or both at the same time, which then requires the data to be essentially shared between them. Let's look at an example. Here we have the Pixar kitchen set loaded and the Bifrost graph in place. And what I've done here is I've used the add to stage node, but I've actually created a whole new stage called kitchenmodified.usd. And this is the root layer for my new stage. And then I've opened up the kitchenset.usd file and I'm using that to drive my data through the graph. If we take a look at the USD layer editor, it's showing this unshareable layer. What I want to do now is select the USD proxy node here in the outliner and go to the attribute editor. And what I want to highlight is this option here, shareable, underneath the stage section. Now notice that at the moment this box is unchecked. Now looking at the layer editor here, the USD layer editor, notice what happens when I decide to check the box. The unshareable layer has gone and we're just left with the main root layer to the stage and the kitchenset.usd layer that we're loading. If I uncheck the box, the unshareable layer comes back. What this actually means is that when the option is turned off like it is now, and we have the unshareable layer in place, anything we do to this data in Maya isn't actually being performed or shared with Bifrost USD. We're using Bifrost USD to load the stage and the data, but because we've got it unshared and we have an unshareable layer, Maya has actually copied the output from Bifrost, duplicated it and put it on its own unique root layer called unshareable layer. So what we're seeing here isn't actually the output of the Bifrost graph, it's actually a copy of it. It's being driven by the kitchen set that we've loaded and the graph, but this new unshareable root layer allows it to exist as a unique stage that we can now manipulate in USD for Maya. So let's say that I need to do an edit on this scene. Our Maya scene is set to Y up, but our whole data set is Z up, and we need to change that. If I expand out the hierarchy and I'll choose the kitchen set group here, and with my rotate tool, I'll just do a rotation here manually in the viewport. quite crudely. And to be more precise, I'll just go to my attribute editor or my channel box. It doesn't really matter. And I'll just make sure it's set to -90 so it's accurate. Now I've done this in the viewport or with the channel box, but not with the Bifrost graph itself. Now I've performed an edit, but this edit must be stored on some form of layer with USD, and this is what the unshareable layer is actually there for. It allows me to perform edits on this stage with USD in Maya, but not Bifrost-USD, even though we've used Bifrost-USD to load the initial data. Now, although I've made these edits on a layer, they're not being saved out to a file like normal USD layers should be. There's no save disk icon here in the USD layer editor. Instead, the data is stored in memory by Maya, and as long as this layer is visible, it will be saved whenever you save the Maya scene. If I decide to add additional layers here, they're created as anonymous, but there's still no ability to save them to disk, but we can still make edits to the data, and those edits will be saved with the Maya scene. For example, I'll target this layer here, this anonymous layer 3, and this say I want to do a very crude example. I want to move this table here, so I'll choose the group in the hierarchy like so, and I'll just move it in the viewport. Now I've made the change, and because I chose this layer here, that change will appear on this layer, and we can see that in the script editor. So again, I'll just clear this, and if we now right click this layer, print to script editor, and we can see anonymous layer here. There's kitchen set, props, dining table, kitchen table 1 group, and then there's the transform. So the edit is there, stored in memory on this layer. And if I was to save this Maya scene out, this edit would be saved as part of the Maya scene. Now that all seems okay, but what happens now if we want to now use Bifrost-USD to work on this stage? Well, we go to our proxy node, go to our attribute editor, and now we tick the shareable box. And notice what's happened. Our unshareable layer has now gone, and the edits that we performed have also gone. The USD layer editor now looks as we would expect it to, and we now have the return of the save disk icon, which allows us to save any layers out to disk as separate USD files. Now we can use Bifrost-USD to make any edits. So to save time, I've already created the necessary nodes. So what I'm doing is I'm performing an X form here with this attribute, and I'm defining a USD transform, and I've got it set to -90. So if I plug this into here, my stage is rotated. I'm also going to do a rotation in the Y, say 45 degrees, just so that it looks a little bit different to what we had before. But what I'm doing here is all with Bifrost-USD. Now, if we go back to the attribute editor now and turn off shareable, our unshareable and anonymous layers return, and the stage reverts back to the changes that I made on those respective layers. So what this option does is it allows you to switch back and forth between the two contexts of USD for Maya and Bifrost-USD. Now this isn't perhaps an ideal way of working, but the mechanism is required so that any changes in USD and Maya can remain and persist as you work in the Bifrost-USD graph. This is because the graph is being reevaluated literally all the time. Every time you create a node or connection or make a change, the stage is being updated. So if I'm working in shareable mode, for example, so now we're going to be using Bifrost-USD, and this just say, as a very crude example, choose this chair and I want to move it, and I'm going to do it inside the viewport. So I'll just transform it and I'll move it out there. Now if I go to my graph and make any kind of change, let's say I want to change this value to say 90. The stage is rotated, but notice how the chair has moved back to its original position. Any change or edit that I made in the viewport is lost, because the graph has been re-evaluated when I've made a change, and so essentially it's taken precedent over any changes I've made in the viewport. So what's the takeaways here? Well, if you're intending on using Bifrost-USD, then it's likely best to stay in this context of shareable all the time. because anything you want to do to your stage should be done within the graph. Don't make any changes to stage or data in the viewport because they'll be lost, just like I just demonstrated. Now, staying in a graph also allows you to get the most out of the procedural workflow whilst also keeping things consistent. So why even have this mechanism of switching between the two different modes? Well, the best way I think of it is that with Bifrost-USD, this gives you the ability to have a sandbox version of the stage that comes with its own root layer. And that means that you can make any edits or tests to the stage that can be saved with the Maya scene without them actually affecting your Bifrost-USD graph. Now, bear in mind that having this copy, you might say, of the stage on an unshareable layer, and then having any additional anonymous layers will require extra memory, and quite a lot if you've got a big stage with a lot of data. So personally, though I get the concept, I'd rather be consistent and work with the shareable option on. So then I'm always using Bifrost-USD to create my stages and do any kind of manipulation. So that's how stages work in the context of using Bifrost-USD. I hope my explanation has helped somewhat to understand this, as it's very important when intending to work in Bifrost-USD. In my next video, we'll start to explore how to build out a stage with layers, start adding some data, and then how we save out our stage and our layers. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.